be presiding this session, which is on Manuscript tradition, and it's our privilege to have among us Professor Alexei Lidov, who's going to talk about the post-Byzantine model books and the distortion of the Byzantine iconicity. Very interesting topic. We're looking forward to your talk, Professor.
Thank you very much. So, good morning, everybody. Oh, no, it's what is going on? Yes, and first of all, I should confess that my paper has nothing to do with the manuscript tradition. So, what I'm going to say will be a kind of theoretical and provocative statement about the role of the model books in the post-Byzantine period, and mostly in Russia. And probably I will start with a general thesis, and then, because we're limited in time, I will show some pictures with short comments. So, this is the generalization of this statement, which I called provocative. You know that in English, provocative is not totally negative word, as in Slavic languages it's have double meaning. So, and let me the modern approach is already a few centuries old. Unreversible changes in the sphere of icon painting were introduced around the fall of Byzantium in the middle of the 15th century, and the 16th century ultimately did away with iconicity. The appearance of the icon painter's pattern book, so-called in Russian лицевой иконописный подлинник, in the 16th century was one of the crucial factors in the development of Russian art after 1453. It dramatically altered the basic Byzantine concept of icons as spatial images, mediating between the earthly and heavenly realms. Moreover, the process of creating an icon then completely changed. The icon painter was given a certain selection of patterns, an outline that was to be transferred to the board, and a design that was to be colored in. The Byzantine technology was principally different. The icon painter, who was inspired by several models from different periods, created his own image, sometimes keeping the patterns in mind, as we know from the letter which I will quote later by the Russian monk Epiphany the Wise, who documented the manner of painting of Theophan the Greek. So, I am starting with this picture with two images of Christ, and there are something like 250 years between these two images. But it's quite obvious in my view that the difference could not be explained only by the gradual evolution of stylistic manners. we have here two different metrics of icons and understanding of iconicity. In a way, in the first image, so-called Звенигород Sever, we have an example of Byzantine iconicity of early 15th century, and an image by Simon Ushakov from the middle of the 17th century. We have something else which we can describe as in a way, material object and subject related to the Western European tradition. In a way, something which, provincial version of the Western Baroque imagery. So there is a gap between these two iconic images. And we're able to fill this gap, for example, when we are coming to the halls of the Tretyakov Gallery with the biggest collection of Russian icons in the world, and coming from the hall of the 15th century to the hall of the 16th century. And I remember since my student years that many people asked me what actually happened, because visually the images were very similar, with the same patterns, with the same schemes, but the whole atmosphere in the among the 16th century icons was quite different from the previous one. And we can see these changes in some other fields of Russian culture. For example, in architecture, we can see not just the stylistic difference between this building of early 15th century in the Andronikov monastery and the most famous St. Basil Cathedral on the Red Square, which appeared a little bit more than a century later. And of course, we know now that this cathedral, St. Basil Cathedral, was built by Italian master builders, but these Italian Renaissance architects received the models, and even the models were very different from the original 15th century cross in dome church, which actually we have in the Andronikov monastery, with some changes. Some scholars call these changes Muscovite changes, but the typology, the imagery is still the same. I mean, Byzantine, and totally non-Byzantine image which appeared in the 16th century. And also there are new typology of icons which could appear only in the 16th century but not before. We are not able to imagine the icons like these famous icons, blessed the host of the King of Heavens, also from the Tretyakov Gallery, in the 15th century. But in the 16th century, such kind of imagery became a mainstream, as, for example, this very famous and important icon, so-called the four-partite icon from the Kremlin. And actually, this icon became the focus of very important discussion about icons in the history of Russian mind, and the time of Metropolitan Makary, and so it's famous as the fair of Ivan Viskovati, who actually had, serious doubts how it's possible to paint such kind of icons, and these icons in his view, were not Byzantine, and he was right. Finally, by the council, I mean, Ivan Viscovati was declared to be wrong, and even accused. But we may see that it's new type of imagery, very often taken from Western engravings. For example, like this detail with apocalyptic horsemen certainly came from the Western tradition. So I would like to say that even in that period, in the 16th century, when officially, formally, the rulers and the leading artists of that time declared that they are following Byzantine tradition, in practice, they changed the paradigms of the Byzantine iconicity. And it seems to me very important to realize this, radical changement for understanding what was going on further. And the icon painter's pattern book played a very serious role in this process. By the way, I did a small research and realized that the very first known pattern book in Russia belonged to the late 16th century, very late 16th century. It's from the State History Museum in Moscow, and it's we may guess or speculate that they were a prototype from early 16th century, but we don't have real proofs. So it means that the pattern book, so-called лицевой иконописный подлинник, is actually an invention of the 16th century, not earlier. And then it's an example from the 16th century pattern book, and I may ask this highly professional audience, are we able to consider this kind of image as an icon? Or just a scheme, an instrument to make icon? And my point is that it's still not an icon, but something else. And also we know that the icon painters' pattern books, they determined not just the schemes, the general schemes, but sometimes the style of the paintings. So there are two examples, and one is to the left is more archaic scheme, and more, in Western terms, advanced scheme from the Baroque period. So the icon painters who used these schemes, they received not just the general idea, but even some stylistic instruction, what kind of patterns they should follow. And the whole process, which we believe as a very traditional, and the people who are doing today the icon paintings, they believe that this process is Byzantine. I mean, to create icons stage by stage. But unfortunately, most probably it's not Byzantine. It's a new technology, very much related to the appearance of the pattern books in the 16th century. And in a way, even not specifically Byzantine, but principally non-Byzantine. So we have this, everybody knows, and you may find that every manual for icon painters, how to make a proper icon. I mean, taking the pattern book, a scheme from there, put it on the board, and then to paint the scheme. So we should recognize that this whole technology may be good, maybe not, depends of the view, but it's not Byzantine. It's something else invented in post-Byzantine period. And actually we, may ask what was going on in Byzantium. Just to remind you, with this miniature depicting Andrei Rublev painting an icon on the wall of the Andronikov Cathedral. And this also most famous imagery by Theophan the Greek from Novgorod. And I mean, it's quite clear, even without the special explanation, that this kind of images was painted without any pattern books and any schemes. And actually we have, again, very well known, but still extremely important evidence from the letter of Epiphanes the Wise to his friend Cyril of Tver about the actually Byzantine technology, how Byzantine painters used to work. When he's describing with great surprise what Theophan the Greek was doing in the Moscow Kremlin. And I will quote, while he delineated and painted all these things, no one ever saw him looking at models, as some of our painters do, who, being filled with doubt, constantly bent over them, casting their eyes hither and thither, and instead of painting with colors, they gaze at the models as often as they needed to. He, however, seemed to be painting with his hands, while his feet moved without rest. His tongue conversed with visitors. His mind dwelt on something lofty and wise, and his rational eyes contemplated that beauty which is rational. So, of course, I mean, Epiphanes the Wise compares Theophan the Greek with contemporary Russian icon painters, but mentioning that they were regularly looking at models. But we should realize that these models were not patterns, and were not pattern books for icon painters. It was most probably a combination of different models. And actually, I should say that the idea of this paper and of this way of thinking came to my mind 15 years ago when I visited in 2004 after the pogroms in Kosovo, the Dechani monastery, which at that time in 2004, so I was in the UNESCO mission as an expert. And in 2004, they created as a form of resistance to this horrible situation around, I mean, the Orthodox monks, they created a new community in Dechany monastery, and they started to reconstruct the Byzantine manner of chanting, and also they created a new icon painters workshop where I could see, when we visited with the mission this workshop, I could see an icon painter who used to paint an icon of Christ Pantocrator, but he had in front of him on a special stand 6 different icons from 6th to 15th century, the masterpieces of Byzantine art, starting with the famous Sinai Pantocrator up to the icon of the 15th century. And he was looking on this icon of these masterpieces of different periods to create his own image of the 21st century. And I realized that actually what I am able to see is a kind of true Byzantine technology. But in case of Theophan the Greek, these icon painters certainly had this imagery in their mind. They remember it, this set of great images. So, to conclude, the common contemporary perception of icons as flat and decorative pictures charged with particular religious messages dates back to this unofficial reform, which declared the following to Byzantine models, but in practice destroyed the principle of the Eastern Christian iconicity. This is in no way the Byzantine approach to creating an image. Rather, it is a distortion which arose in the 16th century, was consolidated in the 17th century, and became a standard of sorts which has persisted to our day. And this is precisely why the absolutely spatial effect of the Byzantine icon is beyond the grasp of even the most highly professional modern masters. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now it's time to invite Stavros Panagiotou, who's gonna talk about Ioannis Kalitzis' manuscript and its influence of Procopius of Caesarea. Mr. Panagiotou? No? So I think we're gonna invite Alexander Zaminsky to come, who's gonna talk about the evangelists and their symbols in the sketches of a Greek manuscript in Harvard. Manuscript is housed in Houghton Library, step 215.
Okay, thank you. So, how to operate with this?
Yes.
Just this?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. The Greek manuscript in Harvard, Houghton Library, call number TIP 215, has been recently attributed to a close circle of late 10th century Gospel books written in Constantinople. The group includes exquisite codices such as Vienna Supplementum Graecus 50 and prosaic ones in St. Petersburg National Library Greek 67 and Moscow Historical Museum Mus 3644, the last being dated to 999. Though originally lacking miniatures, the Harvard Gospel is of fine quality and 1.5 times the size of the related books. This impressive size seems to suggest that the manuscript should have been intended for public liturgy. However, the text is not provided with any liturgical equipment, be it notation, indications of the liturgical calendar, or incipit of pericopes. Instead, variant readings copied by the original scribe from other versions of the gospel text are disseminated throughout the broad margins of the manuscript. Thus, the book is a unique example of the gospel scholarly edition in Byzantium, which might explain its prominence in the group and pertain to the original omission of the evangelist's portraits. Each gospel in Harvard manuscript had been introduced by a poem on the evangelist, inscribed in gilded majuscule on the page opposite the beginning of the sacred text. Subsequently, however, the poems were erased to allow room for the drawings of the evangelists accompanied by their symbols. Were the drawings intended to become miniatures, they would most probably have been placed on a separate leaves, fit for the laborious process of painting. But the verses occupied the last page in a choir of 6, 8, or even 10 leaves. You can see the signature here, signifying the end of the choir. At a later date, portraits of the evangelists painted on separate leaves were inserted into the book indeed. Why then were the pen drawings substituted for the poems written in magnificent gilded script? The poems left behind enough traces to have been identified by Gary Wicken. You see the traces of the poems here is the most visible in the image of Luke. Quoted and qualified by Hermann von Soden as most commonly used in Greek Gospel manuscript, the set briefly characterizes each of the evangelists and their respective Gospels. The 4 versified lines which were placed at the opening of St. John's Gospel may serve a good example of the poem's content. John, the best of all the evangelists, the thunder-like voice of God, who found the omnipotent beginning of the firstborn wisdom, the first appearing God who had begotten God. Thus John took away strength of disastrous heresies. Missing in these lines is the mystical symbol of the evangelist, and it is probably this circumstance that, having once turned into an important shortcoming, led to the decision to replace the poems with drawings. The best confirmation of this is the image of John, whose unusual composition is caused by the appearance of the symbol. In the oldest examples of the revelation of John on Patmos, From the end of the 10th century to the year 1060, there is no landscape. When it finally appears, the mountain fills the empty space above Prochorus, up to the same level as the Evangelion standing next to him. Responding to changes in style, the mountain fills the void in the pictorial surface. Once found, this order prevailed until the beginning of the 13th century. At Harvard, the mountain rises on the other side. Its slope, therefore, descends through the entire image in the opposite direction, from right to left, echoing the movement of the evangelists, transmitting the revelation received from above to the disciple below. The everlasting source of revelation, the sky with the divine right hand, is excluded from this scene. Instead, John attends to the beast with a book in its paws, standing on top of the mountain. The mountain thus serves as a pedestal for this new personification of the divine presence, and the evangelist, freeing space for the beast, moves closer to the middle of the scene. The symbol turns out to be the mainspring of action, and obviously was the cause of the appearance of the unusual pattern. The closest resemblance of this composition, albeit hidden under a painting, is a miniature in Megaspelaean Codex number 8. There are at once several oddities in the image. A bird with a book, occupying the opposite peak above Prochorus, does not attract the attention of the evangelist. As in Harvard, St. John is placed almost in the middle of the stage, but it turns out only in order to make room for a low hill with a bare, nonsensically cut apex. All these incongruities seem to betray a remake of the miniature that has rendered its content obscure. And indeed, above the current landscape, the silhouette of the former one clearly appears through the golden background, with the mountain on the right edge where John is looking, and the slope gradually descending towards Prochorus, as in Harvard's drawing. I have no pointer.
Here's a point.
Oh, there is, okay. Here? How can we get one? This?
I think this one.
This one? No.
You can, yeah. Use it.
Ah, with the mouse. Oh, right. No mouse. But I show this. It is very, very easy to see.
The middle one should be for
You see? It's very, very easy to see this card. Yeah. 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 And next, I show it again. Under the pale silhouette of this mountain, too high for a symbol to be placed on it, a different, denser silhouette rising just above the shoulder of the evangelist is discernible, so that in the gap to the upper edge of the scene, a symbol could be easily inserted. The original composition, therefore, may have been very similar to the one in Harvard. The architectural frame of the miniature and its ornaments related first to this image, and these decorative details, as Lawrence Nies once demonstrated, firmly unite the Megaspelaean Gospel with the manuscript of 1101-1105. All three, according to his conclusion, came from the same workshop. Shortly after Nice's discovery, Robert Nelson added to the group a gospel book in Bratislava with the same architectural frames, related ornaments, and synoptic evangelist symbols perching on the lecterns. In the image of St. John, there are at once two mountains on both sides of the evangelist, and two sources of revelation in front of him: God's hand in the sky and the eagle on the mountain top, exactly opposite his face. The kinship with the Harvard manuscript in this second motif is obvious, but its inconsistency with other parts of the miniature betrays it as a hybrid of the generally accepted composition with a new one, invented for the Harvard Gospel. This was an attempt to smooth the innovation, although not as decisive as in the Megaspillarian book. The Harvard drawing had no doubt preceded these attempts, appearing probably around the same time, the turn of the 11th century, as the original image of John in the Megaspillarian miniature. The quality of the drawings that once replaced the gilded majestic poems in the Harvard Gospel is magnificent. Smooth lines and jerky strokes, a sudden deepening of the ink color, and outlines and folds that are discontinuous as if melting in the light and air, everything here falls into the right place with perfect accuracy, conveying in a few features, as if by magic, both space and the natural arrangement of figures in it, and the inspired expression of faces. The only exception to this perfection are the symbols of the evangelists. The reason for this is most easily seen in the images of Saint John and Luke. To the end, and the book, which it holds obliquely, unlike the lion. This is halo of the bird. This is head. This is tail. Yeah. In the depiction of Saint Luke, an angel is visible even clearer through the sketch of the calf, with a head with a high hairstyle, the wide sleeve of himation, and raised wings. This is wing, head, yellow, sleeve of himation. In the other two drawings, ramps and tails remaining from the previous symbols must have belonged to the lion and calf. The longer tail of an animal on the lectern of Matthew, it seems, should have been the lion's part. This is all the more likely as in none of 6 pairing of symbols with evangelists known in Byzantine art was the calf assigned to Matthew. The initial order of symbols in the picture, therefore, looked like this: by Saint Matthew, the lion; by Mark, the calf; by Luke, the angel; by John, the eagle. With the Harvard drawings, it is shared by the Gospels from Megaspillane and Bratislava we have mentioned, both with the same arrangement of symbols on the lecterns of synoptic evangelists and with the same or related composition of St. John's image. Besides, this order is represented by the Gospel book in Moscow from a synodal collection, Greek 518, probably of the 1080s, and two more manuscripts in Geneva and Moscow, which appeared respectively in the first and probably at the turn of the second to third decade of the 12th century. Despite this dissemination, there was no patristic tradition for such a pairing of the evangelist with symbols. The corrections of the drawing, connecting the lion with John and not with Matthew, the calf with Luke and not with Mark, and relating the angel to Matthew and the eagle to Mark, coincided with the idea of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, the first theologian to have identified the faces of cherubim with the evangelists. This editorial work was made by a different, less skillful hand. A comparison of two images of the angel, the original one at Luke and the secondary one at Matthew, the erased wings and the sleeve of the Titan, gives rise to this assumption. The awkward sketch of the lion inspiring St. John turns it into confidence. But judging from the tone of the ink, which is the same or very close in the initial and secondary sketches, the correcting was carried out soon after the completion of the drawings, probably under the influence or direct acquaintance with the arguments of Saint Irenaeus, or following a respectable model. The initial identification of the evangelist with symbols was considered erroneous and replaced by the new one. The alteration of symbols is not known in other pieces of Byzantine art that have come down to us. A distant similarity to this can be found only in Paleologan and post-Byzantine copies of Bratislava miniatures. Disregarding the model, the copies follow the order of Saint Jerome, generally accepted in Byzantium after the Latin occupation of Constantinople. Thus, Matthew is identified with the angel, Mark with the lion, Luke with the calf, and John with the eagle. Apparently, any other order at that time was already considered an error. But even with these examples in mind, a critical attitude to the issue of the symbols of the evangelists, as it appears in the corrections of the Harvard drawings, is unique. This separates them from other Byzantine works to the same extent as alternative readings in the margin of this book distinguish it from all other Gospel manuscripts. Obviously, a century after it had been written, the book still retained the character of a scholarly edition, which, under the impact of spiritual trends of the late 12th century, led to the appearance of the images of the evangelists inspired by their mystical prototypes, and then to correction of the drawings in this crucial part. Made by another hand, this revision calls into question the seemingly self-evident suggestion made by Gary Vicken that the drawings were intended to become painted miniatures, which unfortunately for us has never been realized. The painter in this case would have been the third person to work on the image, after the draughtsman and his editor. Rather, the drawings were made to enrich the message of the book, not its illumination, and then corrected for the same purpose. In the final Irenaean order of the evangelist symbol, the Harvard manuscript had an authoritative predecessor. The Gospel book, created most probably in 1091 to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the reign of Alexius I Comnenus. Judging from the lively and diverse communication of the evangelists with their symbols perching on the lecterns in front of them, this was the first experience of new iconography. From the height of the lectern, as from the ambo, the symbols recite the gospel opened in their hands, taking up the attention of Matthew and Mark and stimulating John to passionate work. In the Harvard drawings, reading may have already stopped. Matthew and Luke are calmly immersed in writing, in similar postures. But Mark still enthusiastically addresses his symbol and in the images of St. John. And in the image of St. John, judging by the vividness of the scene, the symbol probably for the first time appears as the source of the revelation on Patmos. The manuscripts from Megaspillaion and Bratislava do not add anything to this innovation. In their painted miniatures of Megaspillaion, the connection of symbols with evangelists is rather simple-minded, the lion having taken the place of the book on St. Matthew's lectern. In Bratislava, the synoptic evangelists in conventional poses seem indifferent to their sources of inspiration, while the eagle of St. John, as we have seen, is inserted as additional detail into a conventional representation of the revelation scene. Thus, an invisible border separates the Gospel of Alexios Komnenos and Harvard drawings from the manuscript with miniatures in architectural frames. The author of the drawings, following the master of the imperial Gospel, participated in the creation of a new pictorial canons of the evangelists. The natural movements and noble proportions of his human figures are even closer to the classicist ideal expressed in the mosaics of Daphne, the central monument of the epoch, than the miniatures in the book of the Emperor Alexios. The last decade of the 11th century seems, therefore, to be the most likely time of creation of these drawings. The decorative exuberance of miniature in the manuscript from Megaspillaion and Bratislava reveals a different ideal, anticipating book illumination of the second quarter of the 12th century, the so-called Coquinobath circle of manuscript. However, the open book of the Lion, inspiring St. Matthew in the Bratislava Gospel, and even more, the star-shaped table in this miniature, still keep the memory of the first appearance of the symbols of the lecterns of the evangelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting paper. And now we're going to continue with Elisabeta Musakova, who's giving a talk on the inverted order in narrative illustrations. Reverse ambivalence, she asks for other quote.
The subject of my paper was provoked by some of the arguments exposed in a monograph of a Bulgarian author, actually a philologist, Ilia Talev, on the Gospels of King Ioan or John or Ivan Alexander, widely known as the London Gospels. Talev's purpose was to contribute to, or perhaps to put an end to the old scholarly discussion on the prototype used by the artists of the Bulgarian Gospels. Nowadays, more authors are inclined to recognize it, the model, in the 11th century Gospels Parisinus Graecus 74, but Talev hotly defends the opposite thesis of a lost common model and discards any possibility of direct relationship between the two codices, the Paris and the London ones. According to his observations and deductions, the accurate order of the episodes in several narrative miniatures in the London Gospels stay in contrast with their wrong order in the Byzantine manuscript. Thus he finds evidence of another, non-extant model for the King's Gospels in which the miniatures were correctly composed. Actually, he suggested 2 lost models. However, there are few more scenes in the London Gospels in which the order is also reversed, which puts into question Talef's statement and is once again inviting to reflect on the processes of copying in the medieval manuscripts. Bogdan Filov, to whom belongs the first monograph on the manuscript, the Bulgarian manuscript I mean, had mentioned that 2 miniatures in the London Gospels were rendered in negative compared to those in the Paris Gospels. Talef explains that Filov actually had in mind a mirror image and adds to his list another 3 miniatures, all demonstrating the same situation. The first one is the Transfiguration in Luke's Gospel, composed of 2 scenes, the Transfiguration itself and Christ with the disciples descended from the mountain. In the Paris Gospels, the events follows from the right to the left, which according to Talef is wrong as it contradicts the order of events in the narrative. In his view, the error corrected in the London Gospels is a proof of several things. First, that each Gospel faithfully copied its own model by stencils. Second, that in both Byzantine codices, the Paris copy and its hypothetical model, the composition has been reversed. And third, consequently, that the Paris Gospels could not have been the direct model of the Slavonic manuscript, as some other authors claim. It is obvious that right at the beginning we are faced with at least one preconception of the author, with which we have to agree in case we would like to reach to or to accept his conclusions. I shall leave out the questions: is it possible or efficient to draw each of hundreds of images from stencils? May we expect piles of stencils in the workshops? And is it impossible to suggest that looking at the Paris miniatures, the artist of the Slavonic manuscript was able to arrange the images in his copy in their logical sequence? Instead, I shall turn to the distribution of the images on the page in the 2 manuscripts. Although the illustrations in them conclude the relevant chapter and sometimes the relevant verse, there is an essential difference in the text-image approach to by the painters. In the Paris Gospels, the image of Christ transfigured on top of the Mount Tabor is placed next to the golden cross marking the end of the chapter, the Ammonian chapter, thus staying on the same line with the written text which narrates the extraordinary event. Underneath, as due, are the apostles stricken by the vision. Then, on the left, already walking in the plain, Christ instructs his disciples not to speak to anyone about what they have seen. The building at the utmost left signifies the city to which all they have set out. It should be mentioned that this part of the composition captures exactly the moment chronologically situated after descending from the mountain of Christ with the apostles and before they met crowds of people, which episode is the first one in the next following chapter. Here starts the next event within the story. Concerning the place for the miniature left by the scribe, the artist has made a seamless connection of the words in the text with their visual expressions by using the classical boustrophedon method of writing and reading. When we look at the miniature in the London Gospels, the correct one, according to Talef, here we are, we see that the sequence of events, as they follow in the Gospel chapter, perfectly correspond to the flow of the text in regard with its distribution on the page. On the pages. Luke's story about the Transfiguration occupies the lower part of the recto of the folio, but the end of the last verse is on the verso. Whatever his model, the artist would have taken the most inappropriate decision had he copied the composition the way it was in the Paris Gospels. In his case, he had to solve a different problem, to link texts on two not neighboring pages by images. This is where the story begins, and with these red marks I have pointed exactly the passage of the text which is illustrated at the end of the chapter or pericope. However, the next example of Taleb as if justifies his observations. In the Paris manuscript, Martha's figure on the utmost right in the miniature Jesus at the home of Martha and Mary actually moves towards Peter, who is lying on a couch. The tiny, fairly visible figure of Mary is at Christ's feet, whose position mirrors that of Peter's. Taleb has good reason to point out that only the right part of the scene is misplaced, while the left one correctly depicts the group around the table. The logic of the biblical account suggests that Martha should be approaching Jesus and not Peter. This is how the artist of the London Gospels has treated the scene, with Martha at the utmost left, isolated from the whole group, the arrangement of which reproduces the Paris image. What is more, this sister, to whom Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things," is depicted below her name, repeated twice, thus visually responding to the call. Namely, this disposition of the text, which curiously coincides in both manuscripts, the Greek one and the Slavonic one, must have inspired the artist of the Slavonic manuscript to change the composition of the Paris miniature, whose perfect symmetry manifests a different compositional logic. Hence, instead of being a testimony of existence of a correct model used by the painters of the Royal Gospels, this one and the first example demonstrate two equally justifiable individual artistic approaches to the same text. There is no need to go through all Taleb's examples, but some of those not discussed by him further support the arguments contesting his methods of analysis and respective conclusions. On folio 138, the miniature represents the Annunciation of Zechariah, or the prophecy about the Nativity of John the Baptist, as illustration to Luke 1:8-22. The two consequent scenes depict the angel announces to Zechariah, that's one of the two again, and the speechless Zechariah communicates to people about the vision in the temple. Put in the wrong right to left order, as it is in the Paris Gospels. Actually, as before, this artistic arrangement employs once more the Boustrophedon principle to unite picture and text with a minimum visual interruption, as the illustration is placed between the end of one Ammonian chapter, or rather pericope in this case. The question of how all these parts are numerated is too complicated to be discussed here, so I shall skip this. So let's call it pericope, and the beginning of the next one. So again, the miniatures is a link between the two consequent part of the text of the biblical story. One last demonstration of applying the same principle will be given here by the miniature representing the healing of Peter's mother-in-law in both London and Paris Gospels. Look for 3840 on corresponding folios. I'm not going to refer to them. It is placed immediately below the short Ammonian chapter 26, and in the same frieze is included the scene healing of sick people, preceding the story told in the opening verses of chapter 27. To explain the verse composition as a means to build a coherent and unbroken text image narrative through the boustrophedon reading is more reasonable to me than to suspect a mistake left unnoticed by the artists. Insofar as I am familiar with the literature on Parisianus Graecus 74, no one has commented the reverse sequence of images. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I know at the moment. In relation with this boustrophedonic merge of the text lines and the images composed in friezes. However, an art historian should not be surprised to see manuscript cycle illustrations submitted to this ancient way of written reading once he or she has become aware of its application on monumental sequential cycles in mural paintings, as found in Italian churches, for example. So I shall only quote one of the definitions of the narrative strategies given by Marilyn Arenberg-Lavin. I have no idea how to pronounce the name, in the introduction of her book. An important effect from operating with this principle is the activated viewer's response to a created new narrative, and it concerns equally a painting in a huge space and something painted on the limited and flat surface of a page. Reversed order in miniature painting has been occasionally detected. To name Taurus Roslin's Gospels in Yerevan, Codex Nadaran 10675. I have no picture of this manuscript, unfortunately. It was completed in 1268. In the composition Christ appearing to the holy women, his figure precedes the visit at the tomb of the women, and according to Sirer Fider Nersessian, the reversal is intentional in order to give great prominence to the scene which represents the resurrection. The detected artistic approaches in the two manuscripts mean a very close collaboration of scribes and artists. It was achieved in the 11th century Byzantine manuscripts as a crown of the intensive post-iconoclastic processes of experiments and innovative or renewed solutions in search of the perfectly organized page on which all the graphical elements should cooperate in a full harmony. The recourse to boustrophedon composition was possible only in the narrative cycle miniatures, themselves being another invention of the most Byzantine epoch. Strangely enough, this illustrative pattern remained an exception in the Byzantine manuscript making, but it finds his new life in the Bulgarian royal manuscript and in the later Moldavian copies. Finally, I would like to say that discarding both Ilir Taleb's methods and claims do not prove or disprove the direct link between the two manuscripts. I wanted to show that painters did not work mechanically, but reacted to the text and its relation to the images. They were skillful enough to need not stencils to produce series of images, which were already conventional to a certain extent. It was suggested several times at this conference, even half an hour ago, that copying does not necessarily mean producing an identical image, and recent researches have seriously shaken the concept of Musterbuch. Therefore, I think that the Paris manuscript could have been the model which the painters of the royal manuscript referred to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Mushakova, and now it's time to invite Nikolina Alexandrova to give her paper. Is Miss Alexandrova here? No? Maybe Stavros Panagiotou is here, who's supposed to speak. No. So it's time to have our discussion now. Does anyone have any questions for Professor Lidov?
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Lidov for his presentation. It's always brilliant. And for first time, not that hieroglyphical that I expected. You mentioned that the date 1453 is crucial for Russia as well. Could you explore a little bit more why? And the second question is related to the icon technique you showed after the 16th century. And you mentioned that it is not already Byzantine. It has another provenance. Provenance from where? And in what terms?
I missed the original point about what we were talking about which event.
You showed a picture of the different steps of producing an icon.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it is not already Byzantine, the technique of producing an icon. What kind of provenance has this technique for you?
Yes. Well, but I'm sitting there. Yeah.
Well, yes. So, I mean, the second question, it's much easier. So we have a kind of canonical technology of icon painting. And what I have shown actually, you may find in any manual for icon painters and restorers to demonstrate what is the technology of so-called Byzantine icon painting everywhere. And everywhere, icon painters, new icon painters trained this way. I mean, stages by stages, I mean, using the schemes which they obliged to put on the boards and then to paint the schemes. So, and what I suggest that the technology as a whole is not Byzantine. So, and actually, first of all, most probably it did not exist in Byzantium. And secondly, it's something which destroys the so-called Byzantine iconicity. And if you mentioned the hieratopical aspect of the story, that what is actually the difference between the image from Zvenigarod deities and the image by Simon Ushakov, which were on the screen. So, because the image from Zvenigarod deities had this spatial dimension. I mean, this iconicity means the mediating image. Mediating is crucial. So something which transferring the believer or person looking at the icon to another world. What actually Simon Ushakov doing is just an object. It's as a matrix, it's a kind of Western religious picture. So there is a crucial change in approach. And therefore, but the situation would be simple, but it's complicated because these people since 16th century, and even in the time of Simon Ushakov and some theoreticians in Russia, for example, Iosif Vladimirov, who was very close to Simon Ushakov, and was his, let's say, promoter of Simon Ushakov's style. He used to write that what Ushakov is doing is true Byzantine tradition. So these old-fashioned icons, they are not Byzantine, but this is true Byzantine. So and all these people who are practically destroyed the Byzantine iconicity, they declare it that they are doing true Byzantine work and following the most important Byzantine models. And this is really interesting and a complex story. About 1453. Yes, it was a crucial date for the whole Byzantine world because the Constantinople is a spiritual and cultural and artistic center, practically disappeared at that time after the invasion. But even before, you know that it was for Russia, this process started before the Russian Church with Constantinople, which practically as you probably remember, in 1448, the Russian Church declared its independence from Constantinople illegally, non-canonically. So, and recently, in conjunction with Ukrainian events, this date was well remembered. So it means that, any date, particular date is conventional, but in our consciousness, it divided two worlds, and actually the post-Byzantine world not just followed the previous tradition, but changed them a lot and distorted them. And we don't realize this. And that was actually the most important point of my paper, to call our attention that it was a huge and inner change in the Byzantine tradition.
The fall of Constantinople could not be the reason to look at the West. It's an inner evolution.
So, any more questions for Professor Lidov? So I think it's time to go on and have questions for Mr. Zaminsky. No?
I would like to comment because it was extremely interesting what we were shown, and I confess that I got a little bit lost among so many examples, and I would ask you just to, if it is not boring for the audience, of course, just to remind. Were these sheets with miniatures inserted into the Harvard manuscript, or not? This is what I somehow, and then I shall ask another question.
The drawings are made on the last pages of the full choirs, these choirs are the last in the respective gospels. They are of different size, 6 or 8 leaves, depending on how much material should be placed on it. As for miniatures, they were painted indeed on separate leaves and inserted later into the manuscript. What time they were inserted is a point of discussion. I have my idea about it, but it is not proper place and time to take. maybe later.
Just one, maybe a little bit more about the symbols of evangelists, because we know from the books, at least from of Galavaris and Nelson, about actually any possible combination between an evangelist and his symbol. Is it possible to explain this change with some general change in the attitude to the right order of the evangelists and their symbols? Is it, how to say, historically limited in some time or not?
At the moment, it is known that symbols of the evangelists inscribed with their names appeared in the second half of 11th century only. It is the first example being the four Gospels in Athens, number 57, according to Nelson and Galavaris as well. In Byzantium, again, these authors demonstrated it. There was no right order of symbols. There were different orders. And almost all of them, we know of 6. Of 5, we can say that they somehow go back to patristic tradition. Nelson is more accurate about this because he wanted to show direct links of symbols to text. And Galavaris, who flew high in heavens, he just pointed out that this order is like, say, in this or that patristic book. Not at all.
Any more questions for Alexander Zaminsky? May I ask a question? What about this third person who you said was involved? Is this a groundbreaking view? Because in my eyes, I'm not, in no case, especially this on manuscript, but isn't it groundbreaking to have a third person after the one who writes the text, another who does the sketches, and another one does the real painting?
We don't know about this practice to draw, to prepare a way for a painter by drawing something in advance. Usually it was one person who did this job.
It's fascinating.
You know, yeah.
So now we shall pass to Professor Msakova and questions on her paper. Any questions or remarks? So let me ask a question. Do you think that this, let's say, ready-made copies and assembling it all together goes at the same time, applies to painting as well? So icon painting and frescoes, the same way it goes for manuscripts?
Maybe I have been unclear in all my presentation because I wanted to say just the opposite. So that there was no need to use such stencils, and that looking at something is quite enough for a miniaturist, and they work well, and they knew all the schemes. I mean, at the 11th century, it is I would stress upon the period because it is also important. and therefore I don't know. I haven't any time to start looking for more examples of such reversed orders in church paintings. The only example I was thinking about was, as far as I remember, the cycle of frescoes in St. Stephen Church in the Sever, in Mesembria. I remember that maybe 30 years ago I've realized that the order of the scenes is just going the other way around, which is not exactly the same example. But this book I found on the internet actually confirmed my thoughts that it is possible to use such an artistic approach to images. And on the book page, it is even more, how to say, natural. But I cannot, at present, I cannot think of any particular example of, let's say, a Bulgarian, Byzantine, whatever church of the same period.
Any more questions? No? So I think it's high time we had a coffee. Thank you very much for this wonderful session. And we're coming back at 11:45.